Hello and good morning everyone, I'm Morgan Donner and today I want to show you a bit of embroidery that I've been working on. This is for a St. Birgitta Cap, which is an extant medieval hat that has an embroidered insertion stitch connecting the two halves of the cap. It's something that I've really wanted to make for a while now, and it took me honestly quite a while to just figure out how this stitch works. And now that I've finally gotten it, I want to go ahead and get it down somewhere in video form so that if nothing else, I don't forget how to do this in the future, and maybe it'll help out some of you who are wanting to create the same thing. So to start off, I'm going to go ahead and use some pins to mark out my spacing. This is going to be much more spaced out than I would use for an actual version of this stitch, but I wanted you guys to be able to clearly see what I'm doing. Next to my first pin, I'm going to come out and over at a 45-degree angle, entering the top row just a little bit past the pin, down, and then coming back up. This is essentially a very normal basic herringbone stitch, nothing terribly exciting just yet, but therein lies the trick. While learning this, I kept trying to do a normal herringbone stitch, but here's the slight difference. Whenever you come up on the bottom row, you would normally carry over your previous line, but for an interlaced herringbone, that won't work. You want to go under this stitch. The end goal here is for this first row of stitches, you want the stitches going diagonal downward to the right, all on top, while the stitches going up to the right are going underneath that first row. For our next row of stitching, I'm going to come up right above the first original stitch, and so traveling under the dark thread, we're going to continue that interlaced herringbone stitch. These 2 points on the dark thread are both going over their neighboring threads. Therefore, this blue one is actually going to go over this line right here for a over, under effect, just like knotwork. For our third row of embroidery stitching, we're going to come up right next to that medium blue, the second starting point that I did, and I'm actually going to go ahead and rotate this around just because for this round of stitching, I find it a little bit easier to work from right to left. Now this cross where our next stitch is going to go, I'm going to go over the dark and under the medium blue. And you see how that X catches the light blue thread I'm working with? Then I'm going to travel down through the bottom of this dark herringbone stitch and just rinse and repeat. Note that if I tried to go this way through here, my thread would no longer be caught by the X. You see how it would just end up sort of flowing freely? So you have to come up and over this way each time you make one of these stitches. If your thread isn't being caught or supported by one of these crossing threads as you go along, then you'll know that you probably missed something. Another thing that threw me off while trying to think of this whole thing as a little bit like knotwork embroidery, I would sometimes really try to go throughout the process to keep that under, over pattern intact, but there are some parts of this embroidery where you're going to have over, or under, but it gets fixed by the next row of stitching, so don't worry about it too much. These pins aren't exactly helping anymore, so they've done their job. Let's go ahead and get them out of the way. For our fourth and final row of stitching, we're going to go ahead and come up near the dark thread, then travel over the light blue, under the regular blue, and then over the dark under the light. Weirdly, we're actually going to continue going under this medium blue as well. Remember how sometimes I said that knotwork mentality will trick you? Weave your way through the bottom X, and now I'll go over the blue under the white, which corrects that weird over thing on the light blue earlier. And now we've stitched up our first square. Here's that same stitch worked in a very bulky white thread, so you can clearly see all of the under-overs and the overall effect and look of this stitch. I don't like it to be quite this big and loopy with all these open spaces here, so I've reworked the same stitch using different spacings so you can see that it's very loose at the top, the one that I originally showed you with, a little bit smaller here. You can see that I'm starting to close up some of those gaps. And then the last one is actually maybe a little bit too tight. It would have been better with a slightly slimmer thread, but you can see how the different pattern starts to look with the different stitch lengths. These white and red samplers over here are a little bit more closely what I would be aiming for with the actual cap, and more closely resemble the extant cap's embroidery work. So I showed you this pattern in multiple colors to hopefully make it a little bit clearer as to what I was doing as I was stitching, but it really looks so much better in one color, in my opinion anyway. This whole video is showing the simpler version of the original St. Birgitta stitch, where I essentially created one row of little crosses, while the original one created 3 rows of crosses, which meant that there was a much heavier base of interlaced herringbone stitches. Instead of just 2 interlaced herringbones, which is what I did here, I think that the extant one had a total of 6. It's just a lot more rows of weaving threads until you finally get that pattern to emerge. But I think that this is a really good beginner stepping stone to understanding how that more complicated version works. So hopefully this video is helpful to someone out there, and best of luck to all of you who are considering making a St. Birgitta cap.